Today we are looking at the very beginning of Abraham's story, and we kind of talked very briefly about the beginning of Abraham's story on last Friday with some of the stuff that happens at the very end of chapter 11 of Genesis. But most of that is just kind of preparatory stuff, just the family line, the genealogy that leads down to Abraham, and then the movements of his family, that they were in Ur of the Chaldees, and then they, as a family, got up and left there and went and were traveling to Canaan, and then they stopped somewhere along the way in the region of Haran and settled there instead of continuing on to Canaan. And we also were told that Terah, Abraham's father, had another son named Haran that died. But we're not told any circumstances about that or anything else about it, just that he died. And so Abram, which is his name at this point, Abram, in the beginning of chapter 12, Abram is there with his family, and then God comes and begins to speak to him and to tell him to pack up and leave. And so he's to take everything that is his and to leave his father's house and all that he knows, and to go to a place that God will show him. And that's it. Just get up, leave everything you got, go to a place that I will show you. God doesn't even tell him where it would be, where he's going. Just trust me and get up and follow. And God promises, if you do this, if you will follow me and go to the land that I will show you, I will give you a land to call your own. I will make you a father of many nations. You'll have a multitude of children. And I will, not only will I bless you, but I will bless all nations and all peoples through you. Through your family, all peoples on earth will be blessed. So God gives him that promise, and that kind of three prongs of that promise will get repeated over and over and over again to Abram. And so we got that promise here in chapter 12, we'll get it repeated in chapter 15, and then again in chapter 17, and again later, and then his son and grandson will also get versions of that promise. And so that's the kind of three prongs of the covenant that God makes with them. I'll give you a land, I'll give you descendants, a multitude of descendants, and I'll make you a blessing. I'll make your family a blessing to all families. And so that's the promises that God makes for Abram, and Abram is convinced. And he gets up and goes. And he packs up and takes everything that's his along with him, including his wife, Sarai, and all of the servants in his household that are coming with him, that are willing to travel with him, all the people that are connected with him that want to come, that are willing to travel with him. He takes them all, and they all get up and go and begin traveling to go to this place that God will show them. And then there's also Abram's nephew, Lot. Lot is Abram's nephew, and Lot is the son of Haran, who is the guy that died, the brother that died at some point in the past. And so it's possible that, or even probable, that Lot was at least partially raised by Abram. And so this is a fairly close relationship, nephew and uncle. Abram, having no children at this point, might have kind of naturally taken on and started raising or finishing the raising of Lot after his father died. But whether it was that way, Abram helped to raise Lot or not. Lot decides that when Abram leaves his grandfather, when Abram leaves his father's house and sets off on his own, going who knows wherever God will show him, Lot says, "I'm coming too." And so Lot and his wife and his family, his household, small as it is, goes with Abram and his household. And they travel, and they are traveling, and they come to a region that is having a famine. And because of that famine, they're kind of forced to go towards Egypt, and they come into Egypt. And Abram makes the first of his many blunders here. And he does something that is odd and ends up kind of backfiring long term. Short term, it seems to go really well for him, but long term, it's a mess of problems. And so as they're coming, what he does is they're coming into Egypt, he convinces his wife, Sarah, or starts talking to Sarai, and convinces her to pretend to be his sister. Because he says, you're a very beautiful woman, and if we come into Egypt, and we aren't large enough, there aren't enough of us to protect us, to make it difficult to attack us, if they see you, they're just going to kill me so that they can keep you as a wife. Somebody there will see you, be jealous, be envious, and kill me to keep you. And so pretend to be my sister while we're there, so that they won't kill me to remove me and to keep me to get me out of the way to get you. And Sarai agrees to this. They do this. Sarai pretends to be his sister, which, as we find out later in the story, isn't actually entirely false. Sarai is actually his half-sister, which is a little weird, extremely weird. But there's people getting married in much closer relationships than we're probably comfortable with fairly frequently at this point in the story. It stopped happening after Genesis too much. But for a couple of generations here in Genesis, we get some kind of weird family connections happening. The family tree doesn't branch as often as it ought to. But Sarai, it turns out, is Abram's half-sister. They have the same father but different mothers. And then now they're married. But Abram says, you're an extremely beautiful woman, and they're going to kill me to get you, so pretend to be my sister. And so they do. And they come into Egypt, and sure enough, somebody notices that Sarai is a very beautiful woman. And they go, and whoever it is has some kind of access to the king, and so they start praising this beautiful foreign woman that came in, and this sister of this foreign man that came in that is just beautiful. And so the king hears about it and says, well, go and bring her in. She can be my wife. And so they do. They go and take Abraham's sister, wife, and bring her to Pharaoh's household. And Pharaoh marries her and starts sleeping with her, and she goes into his household. Well, at first, everything seems to be going really well. Pharaoh's happy with his new wife, and because she's his sister, Pharaoh is happy with Abram. And so he starts showering Abram with gifts and making sure that he gets favorable kind of trading arrangements and trading deals with people in Egypt. And as a result, Abram's household starts to grow. He gets more and more flocks, he gets more and more wealth, and he acquires servants and slaves. And so his household just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and Lot's does too, because he's right there and associated. And so Lot starts to get wealthier and wealthier, bigger and bigger flocks, bigger and bigger household. All of this stuff keeps coming to them. They start to get very wealthy, and then Pharaoh's whole household starts to get very sick. They start to have all these problems, all these diseases, and they figure out somewhere along the way somehow that the reason that they're having all these problems is because Pharaoh is sleeping with another man's wife. And that it's Sarai, and Abraham's wife instead of his sister. And so Pharaoh is now ticked. The king of Egypt is ticked at Abram and goes and confronts him and says, why in the world did you do this to me? Why would you lie to me and say that she was your sister and let me marry her and get into all this mess? And then Pharaoh says, go, get out. Here's your wife back, leave, and kicks him out of Egypt. And so, but when he goes, he takes everything that he has acquired in Egypt with him. And so now he has all of this wealth, all of these big flocks, this huge slate of servants, all of this stuff, and Lot's coming with him with much of the same. He's leaving a much richer man than he went in. And you hear that story, I hear that story, and I think, it's kind of weird that all this went so well for him. I mean, this was an abundantly stupid thing to do, and it's wrong. I mean, morally wrong on several levels. First of all, you lied about your relationship with your wife. Then you allowed somebody else to commit adultery with your wife because you lied. And then you put Sarah in this situation where she's kind of cornered into becoming another man's wife and sleeping with him, which is real hinky, right? I mean, we're getting into rape territory here. It's like, this is wrong on a lot of levels. Why does this go so well for him? Why does this seem to have turned out to his advantage in practically every way? Well, hang on to that. As we'll see as this story progresses, things don't turn out as well for him as you think. Sure, he got wealthy here, but there's going to be a lot of consequences, a lot of things happen, and some of those consequences still persist today. They're still around now. You can explain some of the shape of the modern world from him and his lying about his wife in Egypt. So hold on, we'll get to the consequences. But he does this, and as a result, he and his family become extremely rich. He and Lot both become extremely wealthy, and big flocks, lots of sheep and goats, lots of livestock, and lots of servants, which, by the way, in the ancient world was a pretty good measure of your wealth. You wouldn't necessarily carry around a whole lot of coinage because not everywhere used coinage, and places that did wouldn't necessarily use the same kind of coinage, and so it wouldn't translate well from place to place, nation to nation. And so you measured your wealth largely through the size of your household, the number of people that lived there, the number of servants and slaves that you kept, the size of your flocks, how many animals you had, and the quality of the land that you could feed them and graze them off of, and then how many children you had. How big was your dynasty going to be? How many children did you have to pass the wealth down to? And so that's how you would measure wealth. It was more in terms of number of servants and quantity of livestock instead of a bank account. And so he and Lot walk away very rich, very wealthy men, and this actually ends up leading to conflict between them, because as it turns out, now Abram and Lot each have flocks that are so large it's hard for the land to support them, and it's very difficult for the land to support both of them together. And so their shepherds, the shepherds of each household, of each guy, each patriarch, the shepherds of each household start getting into conflict over grazing rights in different areas. So they start fighting over grazing in different places. And so Abram decides this needs to stop, this conflict needs to stop, and so he takes Lot up to a mountaintop and says, look around, see the land all around us. Our flocks have gotten too large, there's too much conflict between us. We need to separate our flocks out, and we'll just go in separate directions. It's time for us to part ways. We've both gotten too big to stay together. And so it's time for us to part ways. Look around, and you pick the land that you want from this mountaintop. You pick the land that you want to settle in, and you go that way, and I'll go the other way. And by all custom at this time, Abram was the elder. He was the patriarch, and he was also the uncle of Lot, and probably served in kind of a father role after the death of his father. And so Lot had a lot of kind of family obligation to Abram. And so by all custom of the day, he should have deferred and let Abram choose the land. But he doesn't. Lot gets greedy, and he looks and he sees from this mountaintop in one direction there's land. It's decent land. It's just land. You can graze on it fine, no problem. But in the other direction, towards the Jordan River, there is this nice, beautiful green valley, and there's plenty of grass there. It looks like a very rich land. Lots of benefits in that direction. And so Lot says, "I'll take the green land. I'll take the plain towards the river." And Abram agrees, and so Lot goes towards the green land, towards the river, and Abram goes in the other way, and they both kind of settle in and are relatively content. And the thing about this green land is that not only was it greener and nicer looking, but there were also already some cities in this valley, cities in this plain going towards the Jordan River. And one of those cities is named Sodom. And so Lot goes and pitches his tents near Sodom. So he's settling outside of Sodom, outside of the city, but he's close enough to it that you can describe it as near Sodom. And his flocks graze in the land surrounding his tents there near Sodom. And we'll see as we keep going through the story that Lot keeps getting more and more closely connected with Sodom until by the end of it, he's not only living in the city, but is found seated in the city gates, which is a kind of a position of importance. It's where men would gather to do business, and generally the kind of most influential men of the city would spend a lot of their days seated in the gates. And so Lot has gone from being a total stranger who's living in the tents outside the city to being somebody that has enough influence that he's found in the city gates fairly frequently for a lot of time. But we'll see that process kind of go as we go along. And so they separate. Lot goes towards the green land, and he settles near Sodom, and Abram goes in the other direction, and he ends up kind of settling around the trees of Mamre. which is not something that I expect you to remember, but I'll write it down just for good measure. So he settles near near Mamre, and specifically in this kind of wooded area or tree where there are a significant number of trees, enough to be noted, which in this area wouldn't actually require very many trees, but near the trees of Mamre. And they get on with life, separated. There's a problem though. It turns out that this area that Lot has chosen, this valley or this plains area that Lot has chosen, is about to be the site of a pretty big battle. There's a group of 5 kings that band together, 5 cities that band together and go and start attacking various other cities, start attacking various other towns to plunder them and to take their wealth for themselves and to enslave or take captives and prisoners from the town and turn them into slaves, use them as servants. And so this band of 5 kings starts going around and start conquering place after place after place. And when they start to come towards this valley, a band of the kings in the cities in the valley, in this plain towards the Jordan, get together. And so we have this group of 5 kings that are coming and attacking all these towns. And then in this valley, we have this group of 4 kings that decide to band together to fight off this other army that's coming in to attack them. And the king of Sodom is one of those 4 kings that gets into this alliance. And so Lot is kind of concerned here. It looks like by this time, Lot has actually moved into Sodom. He's actually living in the town. And so all of this stuff starts to affect him pretty directly. And there's this battle, this big battle between the army of the 5 kings that are coming to attack and the army of the 4 kings that are trying to defend. And the battle goes poorly for the defenders, and they lose, and they're routed. And as they're retreating, it turns out that there are some tar pits in this valley, and a lot of the retreating army, the guys retreating from the battle, end up falling into the tar pits and getting into even worse mess. And so this army, this 5 king army that's coming in, is able to just come into the cities and start sacking them, to take their wealth and to start carrying off captives. And Lot is one of the people taken captive to be carried off as a slave. And so Lot and all of his possessions are carried off as part of this raid, taking off the goods and the plunder from the city. This five king coalition carries Lot off along with all this stuff. Well, there's a messenger or a servant, something that escapes the battle and knows that Lot has been captured and runs to tell Abram. And Abram, it turns out, has a household that is large enough that he not only has lots and lots of servants, but he also has lots of men that are actually trained as warriors. They actually have some experience fighting. And he is able to scrap together a few hundred, 200 or 300 men to go and try to rescue his nephew Lot. And so they take off, and it's Abram. It's not just Abram. There's a couple of other guys, a couple of other people kind of like Abram that are out and nomadic. They don't live in cities so much, but they have large households. And he bands together with them, and they all go together to go and rescue Lot and the other people from Sodom. And they catch up to this 5 king coalition army and are able to beat them and take back the stuff that had come from Sodom and from the other cities in the plain, and to take back all the captives, including Lot. And so Abram fights this battle, wins, and brings back all the spoils and comes back to this valley, this plain, and releases all the people and gives them their stuff back. And actually, there's a scene in here with the king of Sodom comes out and says, thank you, and please just return the people, and you can keep the stuff. You can keep the spoils and the wealth if you'll just let the people come back, let the people come home. And Abram not only releases the people, but he also gives back all the stuff except for what his men had eaten on the way back, what was in their stomachs, basically, and a small portion that was given to a character that we'll talk about in a minute. And this, he gives it all back and says that he had he swore an oath to God. He made a vow to God that he would not keep anything of the king of Sodom's, so that later no one could say that Sodom had made Abram rich. And so Abram does not want to be associated with Sodom. He doesn't want anybody to say that Sodom is the reason that Abram is wealthy or that he has a position that he has. And again, we'll see a little later why he might have a problem with Sodom. Things don't go well with them. But he gives the people back, he gives the wealth back, Lot gets to go back home. And in the middle of this scene, this kind of a celebratory scene around Abram's victory in this battle, there's this strange figure that just kind of shows up for about 3 verses and then is gone again. And his name is Melchizedek. And so there's this guy shows up in the middle of the story. It says that Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blesses Abram, and there's a short prayer of blessing. And then Abram gives him a tenth or a tithe, and then Melchizedek is mentioned no more. It's like 3 verses. Just kind of random guy that just shows up and then is gone again. And so, he's not mentioned again in the rest of the Old Testament, except for briefly in the Psalms. Why is he here, and why are we even spending a minute on him if he has no real impact in the rest of the Old Testament? Well, there's a lot of stuff connected to or around Melchizedek, and in this short 3-verse description, there are several things that are kind of make you think, or there's a connection, several things that seem to connect to the New Testament and to Jesus specifically. And even though he's not mentioned again really in the Old Testament, if you come to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, one of the New Testament epistles, the letters, Melchizedek and the connection between Jesus and Melchizedek, it takes up several chapters in Hebrews because there's so many things that are connections between them. So, for example, Melchizedek is king of Salem, which is actually Jerusalem, or it will be Jerusalem later, which is the city that King David sets as his capital and is then thereafter the capital of the Israelites, the capital of Israel. And the name Melchizedek actually means king of righteousness, or righteous king. And then he brings out bread and wine. Anybody been to communion service lately? Church, Eucharist, Mass, depending on your tradition. It's kind of a weird thing to mention that this random king from the middle of nowhere is bringing out. And then he pronounces this blessing because he is called priest of God Most High, but he's called a priest of God Most High, of God, before there is a priesthood established. It won't be until the next book of the Bible, in Exodus, that God gives instructions for the establishment of a priesthood through Moses' brother-in-law, Aaron. And the Aaronic priesthood, as it's called after that, descending from Aaron, the Aaronic priesthood cannot be royalty. You cannot have a king who is also a priest in the Aaronic priesthood. They're separate roles, separate offices. They're not even supposed to be from the same tribe. I mean, Levi is the tribe of Aaron, and so all priests are the tribe of Levi, and David's of the tribe of Judah, and all of his descendants are Judahites. And so they're not even from the same tribe. And so when you come to the New Testament, then Jesus is seen as king, but then also fulfilling the roles of a priest, and you can't have a priest king in the line of Aaron. And so the author of Hebrews says, but there is an example, there is a place where we have someone that is king of Jerusalem and priest of God Most High, and that's Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek becomes this very important figure in the New Testament. Do what you need to. So, it doesn't make a huge impact. Melchizedek is not an enormous thing in the Old Testament. It's got these 3 verses and then a mention later in the Psalms. But in the New Testament, there's a lot of things that connect between him and Jesus, and so he becomes a much more important figure in the New Testament and for Christians. And we'll talk about that whole thing. There's a whole suite of different things like that in the Old Testament that are interpreted. And we'll talk about that in a minute when we get to the next chapter. Any questions about Melchizedek and this battle and what happens? There is one more thing. Melchizedek, I mentioned Abram gives Melchizedek a tithe or a tenth. And this is the first time in the Bible that we have seen anybody mentioning or being given a tithe or a tenth. But that's what a tithe is. It's 1/10, and this is the first time that it's mentioned, and it becomes the kind of standard offering, or the required offering when you get to the book of Exodus. It becomes the required offering for the temple or the tabernacle. And that's the portion of all of the other 11 tribes, each all give 1/10 of their income or 1/10 of their resources to the tabernacle, and then that's what's used to support the 12th tribe, the Levites, while they do all of their work, because they don't get to own cities or land. The Levites are just attached to the tabernacle. They're just attached to God. So that's where the tithe comes from, and even now, today, in a lot of churches, there's kind of a tradition of the members of the church giving a tenth or giving a tithe of their income to the church or partially to the church and to other organizations as just contributing to the work of the kingdom, to contributing to God. So to give a tenth or a tithe is still to this day kind of tradition. So this is kind of a weird duality between these last two stories. Abram goes to Egypt and lies about his wife being his sister, and because of that lie, becomes filthy, stinking rich. And then he does this really courageous thing and goes and rescues his nephew and is offered all the wealth of 4 cities as a result, and he turns it down. And so he does this dishonest thing and becomes very rich, and he does this really noble, courageous thing and won't accept a dime. And so there's kind of this weird thing between those two that's always kind of confusing to me or striking to me, is that, why does he get rich off of this dishonesty, but then not accept anything from the battle later? But he refuses all of it. And then in the next chapter, looking at chapter 15 now, God starts to speak to Abram, and says, I am your reward. So basically, I am your shield and your very great reward. And so Abram replies to that and says, what can you give me, or how are you going to reward me, since I don't have a son? I don't have any children to pass down whatever you give me to. I don't have anyone to inherit except for this servant in my household. And so this servant is going to inherit everything when I die. What good would it be to me if you gave me more? And God replies and repeats the promises that he made earlier. You will have a son, and you will be the father of many nations, and I will give you a land, and I will make you a blessing to all people. And Abram says, well, how can I know that that's going to happen? And then God begins this covenant ceremony with him. And this covenant ceremony is extremely odd to our ears, to our way of thinking. But once I fully explain it, hopefully you'll be able to understand why it was done. And this wasn't just a thing that God did with Abram. This was a thing that was fairly well known. It happened relatively frequently in the ancient world, in this area anyway, in ancient Near East. There was several different varieties or several different versions of the covenant ceremony, the ceremony to make a covenant between two different people, two groups. But one of them is being imitated in this story. And this covenant-making ceremony, when it was going, the standard version, they would take animals, various kinds of animals, or a number of different animals, and they would slaughter them and then cut the bodies in half. They would split the bodies in half, cut them into pieces, and then lay those two pieces out opposite each other and create this kind of a walkway between them. So there'd be like an aisle. You can imagine, you get an aisle going down the center of the chapel here. If you imagine that the pews on each side are, instead of being pews, they are pieces of animals. It's halves of an animal carcass. And so they would kill the animal, cut it in half, and lay its body parts on each side and create this aisleway down the middle. And yes, this is sounding really odd, right? Why would you do this? And then, in order to make the covenant, the two parties involved would walk down that aisle while speaking the terms of the covenant. And so each would say what their part in the covenant was, or they would speak the words of the covenant together. And so say it was 2 kings that were agreeing to a treaty together, and they were going to become mutual supporters. They were going to have, it was a peace treaty and then also a mutual support thing. And so the 2 kings would walk down the center of the aisle, and as they walked down the center of the aisle, they would make promises not to attack one another, not to go to war with each other, and to support each other in times of need. And if the other was attacked, they would come and with their armies to defend them. And that would be, they would speak those promises while they walked down this aisle of dead animal pieces. And the whole act is symbolically meaningful, that as they walk down the aisle with these dead animals on each side of them, symbolically they're saying, may what has been done to these animals be done to me if I fail to keep my promise. So if I don't live up to my end of the bargain, may I end up like this. And so it's a fairly strong visual image for a promise that, may my life itself be at risk, and may I be treated as these animals have been treated if I don't keep this promise. And so God gives Abram instructions and tells him to do this, to set up this ceremony. And so Abram goes and he gets the animals that God asked for, and he slaughters them, cuts them in pieces, arranges the aisle, and then he kind of watches over them until God tells him what to do next, and chases birds off of them when the birds try to come and vultures try to come and eat from them. And so he keeps it set up, and he's there, and it takes until about evening. And then in the evening, as the sun starts to set, God causes Abram to pass out, fall into this deep sleep. And there, as he is deeply asleep, God shows him this, or he sees what happens in a kind of vision or a dream. And God comes down in this weird image as a blazing torch and a smoking censer. A torch is obvious. Most people know what a torch is. It's something that can, with a burnable material on the top, a stick or something with a burnable material on the top, and it's on fire. A censer is a little less known, unless you're from church tradition that uses a censer, but it's a device or kind of a bowl that holds hot coals, and then on top of the coals you'll put incense or something else that makes a good fragrance or produces smoke, and then as it's sitting there on top of the coals, you end up with a lot of smoke, usually very fragrant smoke. And so this is how God shows up: a blazing torch and a smoking censer. And as Abram's passed out over here, God has kind of knocked him out. And as he's knocked out there, God passes through the pieces of the animal in the form of this blazing torch and smoking censer. And as God's passing through, God speaks the words of this promise. And not only the words of the standard promise, but God also speaks tells Abram basically what's going to happen to his family over the next several hundred years. That for 400 years your family will be in several generations, about 400 years, your family will be enslaved in a foreign land, but I will rescue your descendants from that land and punish the nation that has enslaved them and bring them to this land and that I have promised you, and give them this land. And so God speaks.
Like Joshua?
Yes, it will. You're looking ahead, but yeah, that will lead into Joshua.
Like Joshua, he carries him through the desert into the.
Well, that's Moses actually. So that's Exodus, which is the next book. And so
doesn't Joshua take over from Moses?
Yes, he does.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, but that's after all the wandering in the wilderness, and just as they're about to cross over and to take the promised land.
So Moses took over from Abraham, and then.
Well, there's several generations between Abraham and Moses. There's lots of things that are going to happen, and it's about 400 years later. And then after Egypt has kind of enslaved the Israelites, God is going to raise Moses up from among the Israelites and use him to bring them out of slavery and lead them through the wilderness. And then Joshua will take over for Moses just in time to bring them into the promised land.
Gotcha.
But yeah, stay tuned for the next 3 weeks for all that. Where was I? God passes through and makes this promise that even tells Abram what's going to happen for the next several hundred years for his family, and makes this covenant with them through this ceremony. Now, I described the way that the covenant ceremony normally goes, and then I just described for you what happens in the story. What are the major difference, or the major difference between the way it normally goes and what actually happened?
Abraham's asleep. God passes through by himself, pretty much in two different.
Yeah, uses two kind of images, but yeah, God goes through alone.
Pretty much promises to Abram by himself what's going to happen.
Yeah, and so what do you think then are the consequences for this covenant? If Abram didn't pass through, what could Abram do that would break this covenant?
He couldn't keep up his end of the deal, I guess, but he didn't make it. He didn't make a deal.
Yeah, Abram never spoke any promises, so there's nothing for Abraham to break, right?
Well, he very much gets this promised future for nothing.
Yeah, he gets this promise for free. There's no Abraham's part to it. It's just God making the promise. And then there's another kind of oddity in this, right? I mean, this symbolism is what has been done to these animals will be done to me if I fail to keep this promise. And God passes through the pieces, right? Can what has been done to these animals be done to God?
No.
Can God be killed this way? Can God be killed?
I
Really?
think so.
Ah, there we go.
I mean,
Jesus.
Human flesh he can, but like is God
Yeah.
himself cannot.
So when you hear this story and you see the symbolism, at first this sounds like kind of nonsense. The idea that God could be killed as these animals is kind of nonsensical. But then you come to the New Testament, and Christian understanding of Jesus is that he is God the Son. He's not just a human being or just human. He is God, the second person of the Trinity, become fully human. And so he is fully human and fully God. And so God can be killed, and in fact is killed in a very bloody way.
He just rose again.
True. But when you ask this question, the question, can this be done to God? And so what meaning does this promise have if God can't be killed this way? Then you look at the New Testament and you see God was in fact killed in a way that looks a lot like this in order to keep this promise that Abraham's family would become a blessing to all nations. And so that way of looking at this story and of looking at the image of Melchizedek in the previous chapter and several other things that we'll see along the way, this is called typological interpretation. And so this is not a term that I'm going to expect you to have memorized and to know for the test. It's just I'm telling you that this so that you'll recognize it, because we're going to see several places along the way in the Old Testament that are interpreted typologically by Christians. And what is meant by typologically or typological interpretation is that they are these stories create what's called a type. Basically, it's a kind of an imaginative or narrative pattern that you'll see repeated again later. And so there's this kind of pattern or this thing that happens, and it seems to happen again in just a different form, but it calls to mind this previous thing that's been done. And so like another type or pattern that you're going to see a lot of in the Old Testament is the son of the barren woman. We're going to see all kinds of characters in the Old Testament that are born to a woman that was unable to conceive. And so God does this miracle and allows this child to be born, and then that child is going to be something significant. Something is going to happen as a result of that child being born that's going to change things. And so there's several figures along the way that are like that, son of a barren woman. And so there's this image or this type that gets repeated. And when we look at these stories of the Old Testament, when we talk about this typological interpretation for Christians, it's that Jesus is repeating a lot of these patterns, or that we see in Jesus a lot of these patterns in the Old Testament that foreshadowed him or prepared for him so that people would be able to recognize him and to see the story of Jesus as fulfilling and completing the stories in the Old Testament, all that God had done and prepared for in the Old Testament being fulfilled in Jesus. And again, that is a Christian interpretation. Most Jewish people don't interpret the Old Testament stories in the same way. They don't. Most Jewish people don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, except for a subset among them that they're kind of normally called Messianic Jews that believe that Jesus is the Messiah that still practice Judaism. Except for a subset like that, most Jewish people don't interpret the Old Testament this way, and so it's not a universal interpretation, just so you know. But typological interpretation is something that a lot of Christians do quite a bit of. So that's the end of this story. God makes this covenant with Abram through this very weird kind of gory image. And the next chapter, God has just reiterated this promise, renewed this covenant with Abram, and we're going to come to his second big mistake. Sarai, his wife, is apparently really anxious that they don't have children yet. God's made this promise; they don't have any children, but it hasn't happened. They haven't been given these children, so maybe it's time to hurry this up.
Can you go through like a sort of understanding on how Lot got separated from Abraham and ended up in the city?
Yeah, well, that's a lot of what we've just been talking about. They got to be too big for each other to, like, their flocks were too big to stay together, and so they separate, and Lot chooses the land that's around Sodom.
Okay.
And then, so he settles near Sodom, and then just kind of, next story, now he's living in Sodom. And so several years had passed there, and something happened along the way. He decided to live in the city instead of in tents near the city. And then the next story we're going to see is he's not just living in the city, but he's seated in the city gates. And so he's been there long enough and has become a person with some influence. And so he's kind of a leader in the city now. But there's not an intervening story there to describe how he made that decision or why he did it. It's just, we just see him getting kind of further and further in.
I just want to hear you about this.
Okay, yeah, no, that's it. He just kind of keeps getting a little closer. And he's kidnapped and carried off as a captive after that battle and then brought back. One possibility is that Abraham's influence, because he rescued a bunch of people from the city and brought it back, that it's Abraham's influence that lets him, he's the nephew of the hero that saved the day, and so that may be why he's able to gain influence in the city pretty quickly, but we're not told. It's just, he kind of slowly works his way in over the story. But in chapter 16 then, Sarai has gotten impatient with waiting on God fulfilling that promise. And so she's thinking, well, maybe we need to do something to make this happen. And so she goes to Abram and says, I have this handmaid, or this servant, Hagar, from Egypt. Take her and sleep with her. And when she gets pregnant and has a child, we'll count that child as though it's mine. And then God can fulfill his promises through that child. And so Sarai gets really, really impatient, tries to jump the gun, and says, take my servant, my slave, and sleep with her and produce children through her. And of course, this is not the way this is going to work out. She can't just, call her child, Hagar's child, hers, and it's going to get real messy. But this is the plan, and Abraham goes along with it. And he sleeps with Hagar, and she gets pregnant. Well, once Hagar gets pregnant, apparently either she changed the way that she was treating Sarah or responding to Sarah, or Sarah started to get jealous and nervous or something, which the relationship between Hagar and Sarah changed when Hagar gets pregnant with Sarah's husband's child. Just take a note, that's going to happen if you have a woman who is married to a man, her relationship with another woman who's pregnant with his child is going to change. It's going to get messy. But it happens. The relationship gets messy. Hagar doesn't want to be treated like a slave anymore, or she doesn't want to be mistreated by Sarah anymore. She wants to be treated better because she's now the mother of Abraham's child, or going to be. And Sarah isn't okay with this relationship change. She's not okay with the way Hagar is acting, or she's gotten very jealous of the situation. And she gets mad at Hagar, and so she comes to Abram and says, this is your fault. Ever since you got this woman pregnant, she started acting uppity, different. She's not respecting me as she should. And so you got to do something about this. And Abram, first of all, that whole conversation seems a little odd to me, because Sarah came with the suggestion, do this, take Hagar. And now she's saying, this is your fault. But then she says, you've got to do something about this. And Abram, instead of saying anything, doing anything helpful, remember Abraham in the garden, abdicates responsibility. He says, she's your slave, do whatever you want. Now, this is also the mother of his child, and by most considerations, his wife. And so, his second wife, and he throws his hands up, says, not my problem. Do what you want with it. And so Sarah goes and starts mistreating, and Sarai goes and starts to mistreat Hagar. And it gets so bad that Hagar runs away. And they're not living in an especially lush area. It's not like she's going to just kind of be able to graze as she walks along and survive. Her running away is kind of a big deal. It was life-threatening. And so she runs away, and she's there by this stream, or this spring, a place where she can get water. And this angel of the Lord comes to speak to her and to tell her that she needs to go back. She needs to go back to Abram's household, to go back to Sarah, because God has a plan for the child in her womb. And God will make that child into a great nation as well. and that for that to happen, she needs to go back and to live with Sarah for a while and to treat her with respect. And so this angel tells Hagar, the Egyptian, that she needs to go back, and then tells her that her child's name is to be Ishmael. And so she knows what to name her son. And what's interesting in this story, I mean, several things are interesting in this story, but one of the things that's interesting in this story that's especially relevant for like your generation is when Hagar runs away and she's been mistreated by her mistress, and she feels defeated, alone. She's out in the middle of nowhere, and she's a pregnant woman standing by a stream, right? And this angel comes to speak to her and gives her this good news that her son is going to be this great nation when he grows up, that his descendants are going to be this great multitude. And told to go back, she gives God a name, and it's the only time that God has called this name anywhere in Scripture. She calls him God who sees me. And this was this wasn't really a phrase or a thing that anybody said when I was younger, when I was in college and younger. Nobody said the phrase, I don't feel seen, or I do feel seen. The whole idea of being seen was kind of an unfamiliar concept. Feeling understood or misunderstood, it was, sometimes people were worried about it or cared about it, but it wasn't really like a widespread concept. But now, I fairly frequently hear somebody talk about or think about, what am I seen or unseen? Do people understand who I am, or do they really see me? And it's very interesting that Hagar looks in this situation and says, God sees me. This is the God who sees me. This Egyptian slave that's been mistreated by her mistress feels seen by God, and so gives God this title, this name, the God who sees me. And so she goes back and lives with Sarah until after Ishmael is born, and in fact until Ishmael is a kind of a probably preteen to teenager. But this relationship is going to be full of issues. And you remember back when I told you that there was going to be problems that came from the whole trip into Egypt, lying about his wife thing? Hagar is an Egyptian slave. Where did she come from? Probably his time in Egypt, when he lied about his wife being his sister. The thing is that Ishmael is going to grow up, and the angel actually tells Hagar that Ishmael is going to be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everybody, and everyone's hand will be against him. And so he's going to be just this source of constant conflict and fighting between him and all of his relatives. And then in the next story we're going to see, God gives the name Isaac to the son that Sarah is about to have. And so we have Hagar's son Ishmael and Sarah's son Isaac. If you trace back the family line for the Israelites, for Jewish people, where does it go? Isaac. Isaac is the son of the promise. If you trace back the family line, or if you look in Islam and in the Quran, where do you think Muhammad's family line traces back to?
Ishmael.
There is still widespread conflict to this day between Jews and Muslims, between those two family lines. And so this conflict, the whole lie about your wife being your sister in Egypt, and then don't stand up for the mother of your child, and just abdicate responsibility, the two things that Abraham does in these two stories, has been having consequences in the form of deep conflict for 3,500 years now. There's been problems around these two family lines for 3,000 plus years. We are out of time, and so we'll stop here. We'll pick up with the second of the covenants and circumcision next time.
Did you guys put videos on YouTube?
I'm sorry?